You ever hear about the Holloway Library? Josh asked, scrolling through a Reddit thread on his laptop. Dave looked up from his notebook. Can't say I have. What's so special about it? Josh turned the screen toward him. The forum was filled with eerie stories, reports of books writing themselves, whispers in the dark, and people getting lost inside, never to return. The last librarian had vanished without a trace nearly 50 years ago. The final book they checked out? How to Escape the Library. Dave whistled. Creepy as hell, but it sounds like one of those internet urban legends. Josh grinned. Only one way to find out. It was how all their cases started, a mix of internet folklore, local legends, and a whole lot of blind curiosity. Their Beyond the Veil Investigations channel had built a solid following, but this was different. If they could capture books writing themselves on camera, it could be their biggest case yet. That night, they loaded up their gear, cameras, flashlights, EMF meters, and an old crowbar in case they needed to pry their way inside. The Holloway Library stood on the edge of town, abandoned but untouched. Its faded brick walls were covered in creeping ivy, and its tall arched windows stared down at them like unblinking eyes. A rusted chain hung across the doors, but the padlock had long since broken. Josh gave the door a nudge. It groaned open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old paper. Moonlight trickled through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns on the wooden floors. Rows upon rows of bookshelves stretched into the darkness. The silence was absolute. They set up their cameras, placing one on the front desk and another near the aisles. Josh flicked on the EMF meter. No spikes, just the steady hum of stillness. "So where's all the spooky stuff?" Dave muttered. Then they heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, the rustling of pages. They froze. Josh swung his flashlight toward the shelves, but nothing moved. The books sat in neat, undisturbed rows. "Draft?" Dave offered. "There's no wind in here," Josh whispered back. A single book lay open on a nearby table, pages shifting as if an invisible hand were flipping through them. The words were unreadable, written in looping ink that seemed to swirl like smoke. And then a whisper, soft, faint, coming from the bookshelves. Josh's grip on his flashlight tightened. "Did you hear that?" Dave nodded. His voice was barely above a breath. "Yeah." The whispering grew louder, a mix of different voices muttering unintelligible words, and then one voice cut through the noise, a single sentence. "Don't turn around." Josh's blood turned to ice. "Don't turn around." His fingers locked around the flashlight, knuckles going white. Dave let out a shaky breath beside him. "What did you say?" Dave whispered. Josh shook his head. "That wasn't me." The whispering continued, a low symphony of unintelligible murmurs. Some voices sounded desperate, others amused, like they knew something the two investigators didn't. Then another book spoke. "He's behind you." Josh's breath caught in his throat. Dave swore under his breath. Neither of them turned around. The flashlight beam trembled in Josh's hands. Slowly, inch by inch, he angled it toward the table where the book lay open. The pages weren't blank anymore. Instead, there was a drawing. Josh and Dave, standing exactly where they were now. Except in the picture, something loomed in the shadows behind them. A twisted shape, too tall, too thin. Josh's stomach lurched. He dared to glance at Dave. His friend's face was pale, eyes locked on the page. "Josh," Dave breathed. Josh swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. He could feel it, a weight in the air, like unseen eyes crawling over his skin. The door. They needed to leave. Josh reached for his camera, heart hammering. "Let's get out of..." A loud bang. Both of them jumped as the library door slammed shut. The echo rang through the aisles, sending dust plumes spiraling into the air. Josh sprinted for the entrance, grabbing the handle. He yanked. The door didn't budge. "Locked," he hissed, panic creeping into his voice. Dave shined his light at the door's antique keyhole. "We need a key." Josh's heart pounded. "Where the hell are we supposed to find a key?" A slow, creaking sound answered him. They spun around. The bookshelves were moving, like pieces of a shifting maze. The towering rows of books slid silently across the floor. The library was changing. Dave exhaled sharply. "Tell me you're seeing this." Josh could barely process what he was seeing. The shelves, which had been neatly arranged, now formed twisting corridors where there had been open space just moments ago. "This wasn't here before," Dave muttered, looking at a newly formed path leading deeper into the library. Josh turned back to the front desk. Their camera was gone. Dave's flashlight flickered. Josh's stomach knotted. "This place isn't just haunted." Dave nodded, voice hollow. "It's alive." And then from the depths of the shifting aisles the whispering returned. Only this time the voices were clearer, more excited. And they were all saying the same thing. "Keep reading." Josh's pulse thundered in his ears. The bookshelves had moved again, subtly but unmistakably. What had been a clear exit route moments ago was now a narrow corridor leading deeper into the library's darkened interior. Dave swept his flashlight across the aisles. The books sat perfectly still, but somehow Josh felt watched. "We need to go," Josh whispered. Dave didn't argue. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a roll of bright orange electrical tape. "Trail markers," he said, voice tight. "If this place is shifting, we need to keep track of where we've been." He tore off a piece and stuck it to the nearest bookshelf. The adhesive clung stubbornly to the wood. "Okay, let's retrace our steps." They turned back toward where they had entered. The orange tape was gone, not peeled off, not on the floor, just gone. Josh's throat dried. "That's impossible." Dave's flashlight flickered again. He smacked it with his palm. Cheap batteries. Josh wasn't so sure. They walked cautiously, trying to mentally map the layout, but every turn led them deeper into a labyrinth of endless shelves, books, and shifting pathways. And then Josh stopped. His flashlight beam caught something ahead of them, sitting neatly on a shelf, right in the center of their path. Josh's flashlight, the one he had left as a marker, switched off. His fingers clenched around the one in his hand. "Dave." Dave followed his gaze, his own face draining of color. "That's not possible," he whispered. Josh's gut twisted. Something was toying with them. The whispering started again. At first it was the same scattered murmurs, incomprehensible and distant. But then one clear voice rang through the aisles. "You've been here before." Josh whirled around, scanning the shelves. Nothing. Another book fell from the shelf beside them, landing open on the floor. Dave swallowed hard. "Don't read it." Josh couldn't help himself. His light shone on the open page. The words weren't printed. They were appearing, letter by letter, as if being written by an invisible hand. And they were writing about them. Josh reached down and picked up the book, not realizing the mistake he'd just made. Josh's hand froze inches from the page. The sentence wasn't finished, but then, before his eyes, the next words appeared. He turned to Dave and whispered, "Let's go." But they didn't see the figure waiting in the next aisle. Josh dropped the book. Dave stared at him. "Josh, what did it say?" Josh's voice was hoarse. "It said we're not alone." From the next aisle over, something moved. A slow, deliberate shuffling echoed from the next aisle. Josh and Dave stood frozen, ears straining. Something wasn't right about the sound. The rhythm was off. Not footsteps exactly. More like the sound of something dragging. Dave grabbed Josh's sleeve. "We need to move. Now." They took a few cautious steps backward. The whispers returned, more insistent now, threading through the aisles like fingers brushing the back of their necks. Josh's flashlight beam landed on a heavy wooden desk. An old ledger sat open on top, its pages yellowed with age. "Look at this," Josh murmured, his fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. Dave hesitated, then joined him. The ledger contained names, hundreds of them, handwritten in ink that had long since faded. "What is this? A sign-in book?" Dave asked. Josh ran a finger down the last few entries. The most recent one made his stomach drop. Josh and Dave. His own name, his best friend's name, written in perfect script. Josh hadn't signed anything. A chill crept up his spine. "Dave, did you?" Dave's face had gone pale. His hand shook as he pointed to the name beneath theirs, or rather the lack of one. Instead of a signature, the space below theirs was occupied by a black smudge, a smear of ink so dark it looked like a hole punched through reality itself. The dragging sound was closer now. Josh snapped the ledger shut. "We're leaving." They turned, and the bookshelves had moved again. The open aisle they had walked through seconds ago was gone. In its place stood a towering wall of books. Dave let out a shaky breath. "We're trapped." Josh clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. And then his eyes landed on the last full entry in the ledger. The name, Eleanor Holloway, the last librarian, the book she had checked out. How to Escape the Library. Josh grabbed Dave's arm. "We need to find that book." The whispering turned into a chorus of laughter. Dave's grip on his flashlight tightened. "You think that'll help?" Josh nodded. "It has to." They raced through the shifting aisles, breath ragged, scanning every shelf. Then Josh spotted it, a small, unassuming book. The spine read, "How to Escape the Library." Josh grabbed it and flipped it open. The pages were missing, every single one. The whispering turned to mocking, hungry voices. Then the final chilling sentence scrawled itself across the blank page in fresh, inky script. "You're already part of the story." The dragging footsteps stopped. Something exhaled, right behind them. The breath on the back of Josh's neck was wet and ragged, like something breathing through decayed lungs. He didn't turn around, didn't dare. Dave grabbed his wrist and yanked. "Move!" They tore down the aisle, their footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. The shelves shifted around them, the space between them closing like jaws. Josh's flashlight flickered. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. They weren't alone in here. They stumbled into an open section, a long hallway lined with bookshelves. But something was wrong. Every book in this section was blank. No titles, no authors, just empty covers. Josh hesitated. "What the hell is this?" Dave ran a shaking hand along the spines. "They feel old." Josh pulled one from the shelf and flipped it open. The pages weren't blank. They were filled with words, and the first sentence made his stomach drop. "The first time Beyond the Veil investigations encountered the supernatural, it was an abandoned mansion with infinite rooms. Josh and Dave never expected what waited for them inside." Josh felt his throat tighten. This is us." It was their first investigation. Every detail was there, the flickering lights, the cold spots, the video footage that had gone missing. Dave pulled another book down, opening it. His eyes widened. "This is about our next case." Josh stepped closer. "What?" Dave's flashlight trembled over the page. "I was researching an asylum case for next month. We haven't even gone yet, but it's all here." Josh's stomach twisted. He pulled another book, flipping through the pages. His hands went ice cold. The book was describing this moment, right now. Josh scanned ahead, his fingers shook. Josh turned the page and felt his stomach drop, because in this version only one of them makes it out. His breath caught in his throat. Dave must have read the same line because he snapped the book shut. "Nope, we're not doing this." Josh shoved the book back onto the shelf, heart hammering. Another book sat on the center table. This one wasn't finished. The words were still appearing letter by letter. They leaned over to read it. Josh and Dave turned around and saw the figure standing at the end of the aisle. It smiled, showing far too many teeth. Josh's blood turned to ice. Dave's breath hitched. "Tell me you made that up." Josh slowly lifted his flashlight, shining it down the aisle, and there it was. A tall, gaunt figure stood in the shadows. Its smile was too wide. Its eyes were sunken pits of ink. And as it took a slow, dragging step forward, the books whispered in unison, "Keep reading." Josh's hand clenched around his flashlight, but his fingers felt numb. The thing at the end of the aisle wasn't human. Its grin stretched too wide, as if its skin had been stitched too tightly over its skull. Its eyes were nothing but pools of ink, black, reflective, hungry. And it was moving toward them, slowly, deliberately. Josh's breath came in ragged gasps. He grabbed Dave's arm, pulling him backward. "We need to go now." Dave didn't argue. They turned and sprinted down the aisle, the shifting bookshelves closing in around them, warping the path. Somewhere behind them, the thing whispered, "Don't run, it only makes the story better." Josh ignored it. They stumbled into another open area, a reading nook with old wooden chairs and a dust-covered table. Books lay scattered on the surface, their pages still moving, still writing. Josh's eyes caught on one book in particular. The ink was fresh. It was writing as they stood there. He forced himself to read. Josh and Dave ran, but they didn't realize they'd just cornered themselves. Josh looked down and saw the book, and his stomach dropped when he read the next sentence. Josh's stomach dropped. His hands trembled. His gaze flicked down to the next line. The figure reached the doorway, blocking the only exit. A shadow fell over them. Josh's entire body went cold. Dave turned and froze. The figure was standing in the doorway. It hadn't walked, hadn't run. It had just appeared. It grinned. Josh shoved the table into its path. The books scattered across the floor. Some of them landed open. And then they started flipping through their pages, fast, like 100 invisible hands were searching for something. Josh's eyes darted to the nearest open book, just in time to see a new sentence write itself. Josh made a mistake. He knocked over the wrong book. The entire library shuddered. The bookshelves groaned. A sudden gust of wind shot through the room, howling between the aisles. The thing in the doorway stopped grinning. Josh looked down at the book he had knocked over. The title was handwritten in thick, smudged ink. The Librarian's Secret. Dave's voice was barely a whisper. "You think that means what I think it does?" Josh licked his lips, his mouth dry. Behind them, the figure hissed. Josh grabbed the book. "I think it's the only way we get out of here." The pages began flipping on their own, and then they stopped. A single sentence stared back at them. "The key is with him." Josh's blood ran cold, because he already knew who him was, the librarian, and he was standing right in front of them. Josh's breath came in shallow gasps. The thing standing in the doorway wasn't just a ghost or an entity, it was the librarian, or whatever was left of him. The air felt thick, pressing against Josh's skin like static electricity. The librarian didn't blink, didn't breathe. He only stared with those black, ink-pit eyes, his mouth stretched into that awful, unnatural grin. Dave whispered, "Josh, the book said the key is with him." Josh's grip on the book tightened. His gaze flicked downward to the withered, rotting belt hanging around the librarian's waist. And there it was, an old iron key, dangling. Dave saw it too. He swallowed hard. How the hell are we supposed to get that? The librarian's head tilted sharply, too fast to be human. Then the lights in the library went out. The darkness was absolute. Josh's heart slammed against his ribs. His flashlight flickered, brief flashes of light catching shifting movement. The whispering returned. More voices now, dozens, maybe hundreds, circling, laughing. "Keep reading." Josh clenched his teeth. "No, no more reading. Action." He reached into his pocket, fingers fumbling for the lighter he always carried. He didn't smoke, but after enough beyond the veil cases, he'd learned that fire was a useful thing to have. He flicked it on. A small flickering flame illuminated the space just enough. And the librarian was right in front of him. Josh didn't think, didn't hesitate. With one desperate motion, he lunged. His fingers closed around the cold, rusted key, yanking it free from the librarian's belt. The reaction was instantaneous. The whispering became screams. The bookshelves shook violently, pages flying loose as if the library itself was coming apart. The librarian lurched forward, mouth stretching impossibly wide. Dave grabbed Josh's arm. "Run!" They bolted. Behind them, the librarian's shriek rose, high and inhuman. The shelves collapsed inward, books exploding into ink. Josh's mind was focused on one thing, the door. He clutched the iron key so tightly it dug into his palm. The entrance loomed ahead, but the shelves were shifting again, trying to trap them. Dave dove forward, knocking books aside, clearing a path. Josh rammed the key into the lock, twisted it. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then the door swung open. Cold, real night air rushed in. They stumbled out. Josh and Dave collapsed onto the pavement, gasping, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. Behind them the library shuddered. The whispering grew distant. And then the flames started. The first flickers of orange flame licked up the bookshelves inside. Josh and Dave scrambled to their feet, staring in stunned silence as fire erupted from within the Holloway library. The books burned first. Pages curled, blackened, screaming as ink bled and twisted, turning into smoke. The flames spread fast, too fast, like the fire wasn't just consuming wood and paper, like it was consuming something else. Josh stepped back. His lungs heaved, heart still racing. Dave was still bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Holy shit! Josh turned back toward the building, watching as the inferno devoured it. The whispering voices didn't stop. They rose, screaming, not in pain, not in fear, but in rage. The Holloway library didn't want to die. The windows burst outward, glass shattering across the street. Ink dripped down the walls, bubbling as if it was bleeding from the building itself. Then, from within the flames, a figure emerged. The librarian. His gaunt form stood motionless in the fire, his ink-black eyes locked on Josh. He wasn't burning. He should have been, but he wasn't. Instead, the shadows around him shifted, writhing. The fire couldn't kill him, but it could destroy his prison. Josh felt something ice-cold settle into his bones. This wasn't a victory. This was a release. The flames roared higher, consuming the structure entirely. The librarian lifted a single bony finger, pointed, right at Josh. Then he stepped backward and vanished into the collapsing building. The Holloway library caved in on itself, a final breath of smoke and fire rising into the night sky. Then, silence. Only the crackling of embers remained. Josh and Dave stood there, still panting, still shaking. The library was gone. Gone. For the first time since stepping inside, Josh let himself believe it. "It's over," he whispered. Dave let out a breathy, disbelieving laugh. Yeah, man, it's over." They turned, didn't look back, didn't say another word. Just got in the car, slammed the doors, and peeled out of there, leaving nothing but a burning ruin behind them. As they drove, Dave nervously laughed again. "We got some insane footage, man. This'll be our biggest case yet." Josh nodded, forced a smile, but deep down a sour feeling twisted in his stomach. Something felt wrong. Something wasn't finished, but he didn't say anything, didn't want to give life to the thought gnawing at the back of his mind. They were safe. It was over. It had to be. But Josh didn't know, not yet, that the library wasn't gone. Not really. And that the story wasn't over. Not yet. The drive home was silent. The library was gone, burned to the ground. They had escaped. So why did Josh feel like something was watching him? He tried to shake it off. It was just adrenaline, just the aftershocks of what they'd been through. The footage, if it had actually captured what they saw, would be the biggest thing they'd ever posted. But when they got home and reviewed the footage, there was nothing. Every clip that should have shown books writing themselves was just static. Every moment where the shelves moved on their own, gone. Every single instance of the librarian appearing, vanished. Josh and Dave just stared at the screen. "What the hell?" Dave whispered. Josh scrubbed through the footage again. His fingers were shaking. They had seen it all, felt it. It had happened, hadn't it? The final clip showed them running out of the library, the fire erupting, the building collapsing. That at least was real. But the books, the maze, the whispers, they might as well have never existed. Dave rubbed his face. "Man, I don't know what to think." Josh swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter. We know what happened, and we got out." Dave nodded, but his face still looked uneasy. They both agreed. They wouldn't talk about the missing footage. They'd cut together what little they had and move on. Josh tried to sleep that night, tried to forget. But then, a soft sound slid across his bedroom floor. Something small, something heavy. Josh's stomach turned to stone. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see. But his eyes drifted downward, And there, sitting just inside his bedroom, was a book. It hadn't been there before. He hadn't brought it home. His breath hitched. The title, printed in dark, familiar ink, sent a cold blade of terror through his chest. Volume 2. Josh snapped upright. His heart pounded. No, no. He grabbed his phone, fingers shaking, and dialed Dave. It rang and rang. No answer. Then his TV flickered on. Josh's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a show. It wasn't static. It was footage, a first-person perspective. Someone walking through a library, turning a corner, stopping at a bookshelf. A hand reached out, fingers trailing along the spines. Then it grabbed a book. Josh's chest tightened. The title was crystal clear. The Last Investigation of Josh and Dave. Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it. Thanks.